Truth. Unforbidden. Truth. Podcast. Unforbidden. Truth. Podcast.
My name is Ann Burgess. I'm a professor at the Boston College Connell School of Nursing. I've been an academic most of my career, although I started out wanting to be just a nurse therapist, but got pulled into, you might say, into academe. And so my career really began at Boston College. And the way I got into this whole field was that Linda Lytle Holmstrom, a sociologist in the School of Sociology, asked if I would join her on a project. And that turned out to be really a monumental kind of project with rape victims coming into Boston City Hospital, a large urban hospital where police brought most of their victims. So that really started me into the area of crime victims. And from there, I went down to Quantico, Virginia to train their special agents in rape investigation. And that is where I also met Bob Ressler and John Douglas and got involved in the criminal personality study that they were just starting. That took me into the serial killer study with the offender. And I also, parallel with that, would be still doing cases on other types of populations of victims. So child victims, elderly victims, handicapped victims, etc. I got in a grant on child pornography. So we looked at children who were used in pornography and also looked at juvenile offenders. So that is basically how I got into academe, how I got into my research, and brings us to today where I have my first book, if you will. I wrote books, but before they were always textbooks in my field of psychiatric nursing. This was the first non-textbook, you might say, on profiling with the FBI special agents at Quantico.
You have a pretty impressive background. I mean, it spans what, like 60 something years or so?
Probably. I haven't counted. I haven't started counting.
So there's so much that I want to ask you and pick your brain about. First being that with your work with treating trauma and rape victims, why did you choose to specialize in the subject of treating trauma and rape victims?
Well, I started, first of all, I wanted to be a therapist. And I was trained as a therapist. My Doctor of Nursing Science gives me that, and I can treat patients, and I can also prescribe medication. So I have a variety of skills that I have. But children are especially difficult because you can't necessarily sit down and ask them to tell me what happened. You have to find different ways. But I was lucky in that in this initial study, when the hospital invited Linda and I rather urgently to come and see one of their pediatric patients, we were able to do that. We had really proven ourselves, if you will, on the adult side of the emergency room. Now they had a problem with a case of a 14-year-old that they didn't know how to deal with. So that got me into not just adolescent victims, but child victims, because it was what they called the pediatric walk-in clinic. So anyone could walk in under the age of 14, I think it was at the time. So I started by using drawings, and that proved to be very successful. You can talk to children and get them to draw. That's what they do in school. They often learn that even in kindergarten, first grade. And that provides me with a very concrete piece of paper, if you will, where I've had them draw what happened. And it's a safety kind of thing that I can go back and forth with the child to tell me more and more and more without having to just sit there with the child who isn't going to be anxious to talk. So that's really propelled me into working with children. And that was actually one of the first cases that I did for the behavioral science unit when they had a missing child. They had two children that had been abducted out in Illinois, and one of the children had successfully escaped from the offender, and they were looking for the missing child, and nobody had talked to this little girl, and because they didn't have any special agents that had experience interviewing children. So when I helped them with that case, that also propelled me into doing more with crime victims.
So were you just exclusively working with juvenile rape victims, or did it expand to like adults as well?
I was doing all three levels: child, adults, and seniors.
Oh, okay, okay.
I've been doing more adults, seniors, because there's a problem in nursing homes with sexual assault. And especially if there's a dementia, people don't want to bring the cases forward. They don't think that they can, if you will, win. And so I've really helped them in that area. That's my next area to really try to write on.
So do you feel in any way, shape, or form that the protocol has changed over the years with treating sexual assault victims, whether that be positive or negative changes?
Oh, I know it has. If you just look at the research that's come out on in terms of rape victims, the interviewing, the assessment, all of that has really been standardized to a certain degree. Then you get into the treatment, and they've done a lot of research on that. They have the cognitive treatments. They have even EMDR, which is eye movement research, has been showing great promise in terms of helping break the image. Any traumatic event, whether it's rape, combat stress, a hurricane, whatever, it's the image that the person can't get out of their memory. In essence, it's a memory disorder. And so any way that you can kind of break that up has been helpful. So I think they've been great strides with that.
What was it like working as a woman in a male-dominated environment?
Well, it wasn't just working in a male-dominant environment work-wise. The society was having a lot of women were really suppressed at that particular time, and it was a women's movement back in the 60s and actually most of the 60s and 70s that got women to meet together. They would meet in groups, and they had what they called consciousness raising groups. And women would get together from all various walks of life, whether they were at home raising a family or whether they were in the work world. And they talked about things that they had never talked about before. And of course, one of them was sexual assault, rape and sexual assault. So that's what propelled the issue to get to the investigative, because they weren't getting anywhere in the court system. Not that they are now, but at least back then, they needed to have their law enforcement educated in rape investigation. And so that is, I think, what really propelled the movement forward. And then to ask me how I felt in terms of being in and I was the FBI at Quantico was predominantly all male. I don't think they started getting female agents into Quantico. Now, they had female agents in the field, but they didn't have them training, which is the education piece. And I think in the 80s, they finally started getting some. So, but I didn't feel discriminated against down there because I had something that they needed. They needed to know how to talk to victims. They had never talked to victims because they investigated the bad guys, if you will. So they knew they were great in terms of investigation, but and they were very interested in the stories. I used a case method. I had interviewed, by that time, I had interviewed probably close to 200 victims. So I had plenty of examples to give them, and they felt that was quite credible to be able to talk about actual cases. And so from that standpoint, it wasn't, I didn't feel it was hard to, they listened when I talked, I think. Most of them did, probably. And they asked a lot of the myths. They asked really good questions. What if she changes her mind? I've had victims, they might say, where she didn't want to go forward. She didn't want to take the case forward. And I said, well, that's very understandable. We have a lot of victims like that. And in fact, most victims don't report. So we're able to work with some of that. So I can't say that I had any, not that I certainly wasn't one of the boys, if you will. I would never be one of the boys, but to bring forward in the female perspective, I felt was very important for them to have. And so I was glad to see that more of the women started coming into the, and the society was doing that, I think, by the 80s and 90s.
Do you feel like you might have opened the door for more women to, I guess, work at Quantico?
Well, I would hope I did. I know something was working to bring them forward, and maybe it was so many victims were finally coming forward, and the males would feel uncomfortable not only talking with victims, but the victims would feel uncomfortable talking with males in that field. And so more women, I think you were seeing that in the police department. They were getting more female detectives, female officers and they would always assign a rape case to that. You really saw that happening a lot by the 90s.
So I know this next question is pretty controversial, so I want to preface it with saying many offenders that I've interviewed were once victims before they became the victimizers. And my question is this: is there a current statistic that defines the percentage of sexual assault survivors who've committed violent acts versus those who've been victimized who have not committed violent acts?
Well, that is a very question that everybody raises, and it's hard to answer because they don't have the statistics. You have too many victims that aren't reporting, so you're not going to get a full perspective. However, there certainly are some. And what we found in the serial killer study, that indeed they were. Now, you have to preface that with, this does not excuse their behavior. In no way does being a victim excuse them. We had you have more female victims of sexual assault, and they're not going out and committing the crime against other victims. The only area where you see females offending is with children, children usually under 5. But to say that a male victim, what we did find, and I think is very important, is things that happen to children when they're under, say, even 5, is very hard to retrieve in their memory. It happened, but you're not going to necessarily get them to remember. Now, we did get that in many of our cases of the 36 serial killers. We certainly did get a percentage, not total, of course. We got more anger at women, if you will, in some of the ones that didn't have any traumatic event. And we got more where the parents separated or divorced, whatever you want to call it. And they would then blame the mother for being too controlling, to being too domineering. But what they would forget is the father was absent. Why weren't they angry at the father for leaving the family? No, they had to get angry at the mother because she had to act as both parents and set limits. So it was a rather kind of interesting dilemma that at least in the serial killer studies that we did and the rape studies. I have a good example of how this memory works in the Jean Joubert case. In interviewing him, he could remember back to being 5 or 6, and he had a fetish, I guess you could say, in terms of wanting to. And he said this: "I wanted to gobble up my babysitter." So that might sound, rather humorous from a 5-year-old, but he went on to want to, all of his victims, he would bite. What he didn't tell, and we only obtained the information from interviewing his mother, is that one of the reasons she separated from the husband was he was assaultive. He was violent. He was a domestic, we'd now call him a domestic violence. And she said there was one incident where he choked her so badly that she said, "That's it." And she said John would have only been maybe 3 or 4. John never remembered that incident, but she said it was so vivid in her mind and was the reason that she separated from her husband. So there you have a memory. The young boy witnessed, no doubt about it, witnessed and saw his mother's choking and crying, et cetera, but drops it from memory. Within a couple of years, though, he's very much into this biting and so forth, and he played it out in his victims, and he started very early as an adolescent, testing, trying out various methods, and then went to murder by the time he was actually still in high school.
So the gentleman you were just talking about, how do you stop sexual offenders from being created or from reoffending, like, if at all possible?
Well, reoffending what crime? Rape? I think you can do a lot of work with rape. In terms of murder, now you're in a whole different ballroom, so to speak. Once they cross the line into murder, it gives them such a high, especially a sexual, we're talking about sexual murders. Let me clarify that we're not talking about necessarily gun shooting or things. That's very hard. And I know a lot of the agents did not feel that you ever could cure them. They certainly always need supervision or some type of, if they're ever released, they have to be under the clear day-to-day supervision of someone.
So I know you spoke a little bit about it in the beginning, but can you tell me a little bit in depth about the hospital-based counseling programs you helped co-found at the Boston City Hospital and what that meant in the time period?
Okay, well, this is back in the 70s. Linda Holmstrom knew that rape was going to be a big issue for women, and so she wanted to study it. We decided to team up. I said, if you'll add a counseling part to it. She wanted to study the victim in terms of from a sociological perspective. I said, if you want a counseling, I will join, but I want to be able to learn about counseling them, finding out what the experience was like. So we started that. We did it a full year. We saw 146 people between the ages of 3 and 73. I'm sorry, 70-year split. We had 3 males. So even back then we were seeing males. And what I would do afterwards, we thought we could just bring them all back in and meet in a group. That didn't work. Linda and I were there, but nobody showed up. But when I would call them on the telephone, they would talk and talk and talk. And I said, this is what we're going to do. It really was the earliest phase, if you will, of telehealth, as we see, or telecounseling. And I suddenly realized why that was so important. They had all the control. They could hang up on me. You know, they didn't have to answer any question. They didn't have to sit and look at me or me look at them. So it really worked on the follow-up counseling. I was able to find out how they were dealing with issues, you know, what was hard. We had divided into 4 group symptoms. That was the physiological symptoms, which pretty much cleared up within the first probably month if they had been beaten up or had any kind of injuries. The social issues, it created a crisis. If they were working, they were going to school, if they were parenting, they couldn't do it anymore. So that was a huge issue. But then we had the psychological symptoms. And of course, that's where we found most of the problems. Although the 4th category of sexual problems, sometimes you can put that in with the physiological, but they had a lot of problems in whatever their sexual life had been before, of getting them back to that level after the rape. So those were the 4 areas. I worked with them. We did follow-up 4 to 6 years later. We published on that and really found almost a third felt they had recovered. Another third felt that they hadn't recovered. And then there was a third that had really had serious problems. But we wrote on that. I mean, in terms of counseling, that was one of the first books we wrote, Rape, a Crisis, Created a Crisis, the follow-up study we wrote on rape, crisis, and recovery. And obviously there was more funding coming in. All of our work was not funded. That was, I think, the other important thing is when there's federal money available, which did come about because of the creation of the National Center for the Control and Prevention of Rape, then other people got into the arena. Not from our perspective, not in terms of studying the victim, in terms of just doing testing and things like that. Very different format. They criticized us for not having a control group. I always thought that was pretty ironic. How are you going to get a control group of rape victims? They don't even come in. So we had to try to impress upon them that Linda and I had a hypothesis generating study, which is what you do when you don't have a lot of information on the particular area that you're studying. Later, people can go in do hypothesis testing, but I felt it would be wrong to do it the start. You don't know anything. If it's there, I think were 3 anecdotal reports in the literature when Linda and I started. So I said, you need more of a understanding of the victim before you can go testing anything.
So when looking back at patterns in serial offenders, what differences can be noted between males and females regarding the types of crime they commit and the frequency that they commit them?
Well, first of all, on the question of females versus males committing crime, women don't commit very many sexual crimes. This tends to be a male-generated phenomenon, if you will, or behavior that certainly has to have some physiological basis. That because the men that we interviewed later on would talk about the high that they would get, it was the rush they would get, and that's clearly a sexual kind of a endocrine type of basis. They obviously have different hormones than we do, which is we think very good in our society, although I guess it's getting questioned now in terms of gender-based types of behavior. But men do commit more sexual crimes. I have never seen anything written where they don't. Now, women will commit crimes against children. We're doing a study now on strangulation, and especially in a very, very minority group of Native American indigenous women and girls. And that matches that if you have a child under 5 and is murdered, that more likely than not, it may be a female caretaker or mother. All other crimes are male generated for the most part. So to answer your question, I think that it's testosterone has a lot to do with sexual crimes.
Unforbidden. Truth. Unforbidden.